Welcome to the Friday Happy Hour with victory strategist, award-winning author and your happy hour host, Annmarie Kelly. Each week, Annmarie chats with women who have reinvented, started over or wrote fabulous next chapters. They share how they overcame their midlife challenges and how you can too. So kick back with some good happy hour something to drink and enjoy today's show.
All of my friends tell me that I'm the good girl, yes they do. They all see me as being so perfect, little Miss Goody Two-Shoes. 'Cause I do something a little risque, they all gasp and I just say, good girl, wanna get crazy sometimes too. They wanna shake off their halo, pick up their...
Hi and welcome. You're listening to the Friday Happy Hour with me, Annmarie Kelly, and you know me. I'm that recovering good girl and your victorious woman empowerment partner. And this is where us victory chicks and you guys who love us meet on Fridays to chat about things we can do to make our lives better, more fulfilling, and give us a little more jazz and sparkle. And I'm glad that you've joined me here today. Did you ever hear of Alice Paul? I'll bet you didn't. And when I talked earlier this week or last week to today's guest, Mary Walton, I was a little stunned that I didn't know. And I wasn't so much stunned by what she told me, but about the fact that I know so little about women's rights, dating back 100 years, starting with that right to vote. And that was really just the beginning. So I invited Mary Walton to come here today and talk with us about Alice Paul and that whole women's suffrage movement. And don't you wonder why they call it women's suffrage? So I'm going to ask Mary when she's here. And I had another one of those 24/7 work weeks. It so happens around this time of the year for a bunch of reasons. And, excuse me, and I'm so ready for the weekend. But this week I did two big things. The first one was that I worked on this year's Girlfriend Gala, the Victorious Woman Celebration. Excuse me, and my committee and I are just chugging along. And I'm so excited to have Good Day Philadelphia's Jen Frederick joining us, along with my friend and comedian Teresa Hummel-Kralinger. And as usual, we're getting some awesome silent auction and raffle items. You know, this year we decided to cut back on the silent auction items because we really had way too many. People were so generous. We had way too many last year. But we still have the Phillies Diamond Club package and the Eagles tickets, which we've been getting those for a couple of years. But now that they're Super Bowl champions, they're an even bigger get. So somebody's going to be very happy to be in that Super Bowl with those Super Bowl Eagles sometime. The Eagles never tell us exactly when they're going to give us the tickets until they get closer to the season, but somebody's going to get good home seats. And some of our raffle items include massages from our local Jester Chiropractic and from Joseph's company, Ease Up. And a few of the local restaurants donated gift cards. Pietro's Prime. Have you ever been there? That's good. Barnaby's, and I love Barnaby's. And my go-to Italian place is Fellini's of Westchester, and they all donated gift cards. And Dansko Shoes up in southern Chester County donated a voucher for a pair of shoes. And if you know their shoes, they're really special. And somebody else that's been donating for a couple of years is Boron Homeopathic Remedies. They always do a nice basket, and sometimes they even give us their homeopathic products for the gift for the swag bags. And we got tickets from Brandywine River Museum, which I just love. Don't you love going there? And even if you just go and hang around the outside and sit by the Brandywine River, it's always really nice there. And the Blue Rocks of Delaware, the farm team, gave us tickets, and Westchester Friends. This is the third year in a row that they've given us a couple weeks at a summer camp. And that's just scratching the surface of the goodies we have. And the girlfriends love those things. And I so appreciate the kindness and generosity of the quality businesses and restaurants. And you know what? I think one of the things the girlfriends like best is that we have so many things. And sometimes it seems like everybody goes home with something. Well, actually, they do. In addition to the raffle stuff, we give a pretty good swag bag. So everybody does go home with something. So if you don't have your ticket yet, I posted I posted a link to that on today's radio wrap-up at victoriouswoman.com. And you only have about a week. The discounted price ends on May 15th, so get your ticket today. The other thing I did this week was renew my real estate license, so I could, so I can let it sit in a referral network for another 2 years. But get this, realtors and people like me with real estate licenses in a referral or a relocation network are required to get 14 hours of mandatory continuing education every 2 years. I didn't have to do that when I was parking my license in Harrisburg. But once I took it out, and even though I don't use it, like if you're a realtor, you absolutely have to. But for those of us in referral or relocation networks, we're really not doing business. But I still have to complete that 14 hours of classwork. And some of it is in a required subject like anti-discrimination or regulations around affecting real estate sales. So over the past few months, I took 2 one-day classes. And frankly, I really don't, because I'm not selling real estate, I don't really get a lot out of them, but I just do it to keep my license active. And 2 years ago, I took a class online that was in real estate investment. And it really was good. And if I was doing some real estate investing, it would have been an excellent class to take to help me figure stuff out. But you know how it is. You have to make certain choices between my business, and then I had to decide whether I was going to buy an investment property or not even buy one, but even just look at an investment property or write the 5-year marriage. And I ended up, as you know, choosing to write the 5-year marriage. However, this year, I took a residential construction refresher course, and it was worth the money. And here's why. I live in a townhome development that has a homeowners association. A couple years ago, something happened near my backyard that affected my house. And since it happened, I've been trying to deal with it and taking the responsibility myself to finding a solution. And then this year, I took this real estate course, and something came up in the course. And I went to the instructor at the break, who was also an appraiser. He asked me a couple of questions, including if I have a footprint. Now, for those of you who don't know, a footprint means that a footprint is something that's covered, an area that's covered. So in my case, the footprint is the area that is covered by my house, and I own that. But if I step outside my house onto the ground, the homeowners association owns that. So that thing that caused the problem, I found out, and maybe I should have known that, but you don't know some of these things till you come up against them. That problem that was caused isn't even my problem; it's the homeowners association problem. So that was a good thing, and of course that's a technical issue. That's a technical issue. The challenge comes in when the people and the personalities of the people and my relationship with those people gets factored in. So it's not like having that knowledge solve the problem, but it did give me an opening to fix the problem that I didn't have before. And based on what's happened, I think it might get fixed, because I've been trying a bunch of stuff to fix that particular problem. Okay. So the time and money that I spent on that class was so worth it. And you might ask me, as others have, if I'm not going to use my real estate license, why do I even bother renewing it? Well, there's a good victorious woman reason for it. When I left teaching, I went into real estate. First, I was in sales. Then I managed an office. And while I was doing that, I was getting credentials like a GRI, which means I'm a graduate of the Realtors Institute. And all of those things meant taking courses and passing tests and going, some of them, were out of town. And some of those tests were heavy in math, like real estate investment courses. So sitting in those classes was always challenging for me because, give me some words and I'm good with them, but numbers, not so much. So taking the courses and then studying to pass those tests was grueling stuff for me. And eventually I had enough experience and took enough courses that I was able to sit for my real estate broker's exam. And I'm guessing it was as hard back then as it is today. And based on what everybody told me then, I was prepared to know that I would have to sit for it, at least a couple of times. Even though I studied my head off for weeks before the test. And it was as difficult as everyone told me it would be. Well, a few weeks after the test, the results came. I was so nervous I couldn't open it by myself. So I called the man who then was my broker and told him, and he laughed. He said, well, why haven't you opened it yet? I said, well, I'm too nervous. He said, well, open it now. So I did. And I opened it, and all it said was passed. And I was confused. There was no congratulations, you did it. There was no brass band. There was no, you're in the 2% of people who passed the test the first time. None of that was there. All it said was passed. Like it was no big deal. But for me, it was a big deal. Now, I know you all have had some experiences like that, haven't you? That you did something that was a really big challenge, and so out of your comfort zone, and you pulled it off. And whether it was a big deal for anyone else or not, it was a big deal for you. What was that in your life? I'll bet most of you can think of at least one thing like that, whether it was passing a test, reaching a milestone in your business, leaving a bad relationship, getting that advanced degree. You have something, right? And probably more than one thing. And think of that one thing right now. Doesn't it make you feel good just remembering what you did? Well, that's how my real estate broker's license is for me. Every 2 years, when I have to take those classes and then take the time to renew my license and spend the money to do all of that, I remember that victory stretch. And sometimes it reminds me that, no, not sometimes, it always reminds me that if I did that hard thing then and succeeded, and I was younger and way less experienced than I am now, I can do whatever hard thing I'm working on now and succeed at that. And to me, Victory Chicks and you guys, that's worth the 14 hours and $250 I spend every 2 years. The memory is a victorious woman reminder that if I'm willing to make that victory stretch out of my comfort zone, I can do it. What about you? What's that thing for you? If you haven't thought about it lately, think about it now. And here's something else to think about. Women's rights. Mary Walton, who some of you will remember as a reporter for the Philadelphia Inquirer, thinks none of us women know enough of that part of our history, and she's been working to change that. So we'll talk about how she's changing it when we come back. So go get some good happy hour, something to drink, and when we come back, get ready for some fascinating good stuff with me and Mary Walton. You're listening to the Friday Happy Hour. Remember when you wished you had more time for yourself? And now you have it, but you notice you're keeping busy with stuff, but that stuff isn't making you feel happy or filled up? And when you think about what would make you happy and filled up, you get stuck or feel overwhelmed. And then you go back to what's more familiar, more comfortable, even if it's not making you happy. Wouldn't you love to find a way to start making sense of that deep discontent you're feeling? Well, you're not alone. I'm Annmarie Kelly, author, victory strategist, and the radio show host of the Friday Happy Hour. And I know there's a place for you, one that other women have found to be both inspirational and empowering. And it's the Victorious Woman Project. Go there now and get on my mailing list, where you'll be the first to know about my upcoming online workshops, teleseminars, and more. And while you're there, take a couple minutes to look over my blog. You can download some of the free stuff I have for you and let it get your creative juices going. I'm looking forward to meeting you at the Victorious Woman Project. And that's at www.victoriouswoman.com. Welcome back to the Friday Happy Hour. I'm Annmarie Kelly, and I'm here with author Mary Walton. How are you doing today, Mary?
I'm fine, Annmarie. Nice to talk to you.
Oh, I'm glad. I'm really glad you're here because I spent the last week or so reading about Alice Paul, and I said it at the top of the show. I was stunned at how little I knew, and I like history, so I thought I knew stuff. I didn't know anything.
Welcome to the club, Annmarie. I didn't know anything the first time I heard about her, and it was only a short time after that I was at work on the book. But you're right; it's astonishing that people aren't aware of Alice Paul and how much she did for women.
Yeah. Well, you know what, Mary? Your background includes working at the Philadelphia Inquirer. How long were you there?
Oh, I was there 22 years, quite some time.
And what did you write about mostly?
I was what we call general assignment, which was anything that came down the pike, even a car accident in the beginning. But as I worked my way up, I did news features, and then the last 10 years I was a writer at the Sunday magazine doing feature stories for the magazine.
So you have a couple business management books. How did you get into doing that? Well,
the first book was on a gentleman named W. Edwards Deming, and Deming had been an advisor to the United States government during World War II on quality. We were trying to gear up and make the best possible armaments, and when the war ended, he was forgotten in the United States, but Japan, which was devastated, had heard about him.
Right.
He was an expert on quality, and the Japanese brought him over to consult with them, and you'll remember the 70s when the Japanese cars and electronics just devastated our economy. And Deming was a hero in Japan. Well, Deming was rediscovered in America after that period, and he went around the country giving seminars, and he came to Philadelphia. So I was recruited to do a story on this gentleman who by then was in his 80s, and that resulted in a small book called The Deming Management Method. Deming was a scholar, and his book was a very long and dense book, but this was just a journalist's version of the Deming Management Method. So that launched my career in business books because it did very well.
So that's what you were doing, and you were with the Philadelphia Inquirer, and so it seems like women's suffrage is a little out of the box for you. So how did that come about?
Well, people think I'm a feminist, and I believe certainly in women's rights, but when you're a reporter, you don't take sides for or against issues. But I can recognize a good story, and when I heard from an editor I was close to about Alice Paul, I knew a good story when I heard it because she launched the battle for an amendment that would give women the vote, and the women who followed her volunteers, fought long and hard, and they were arrested, and they went to jail, and they were force-fed. And then the amendment passed. So it was a story with a beginning, a middle, and an end, which you always want when you're writing a book or telling a story.
And the other thing was that she's really from this area.
She's from Mount Laurel, New Jersey, just
right across the bridge,
Delaware River. Yes, she is, and she grew up there. She's had a Quaker background, Quaker family. And so there's a way in which I think of her as hometown-made girl, Alice Paul.
That's what
made a success, made good.
And when I was reading your book, that's what I was thinking, too. And you know what, Mary, she was a suffragette, and do you have any idea why those women were called suffragettes?
I do, and this is the scholar in me. Here in the United States, they did not like to be called suffragettes because suffragette was the word coined for the militant British women who fought for suffrage in England, right? And the reporters referred to them in kind of a derisive way with that little et on the end, suffragette. And actually, they were radicals. They relished it. But here in this country, scholars, as I have become, will call them suffragists. And we avoid... It's a losing battle, frankly. Everybody calls them suffragettes. But that is the origin of the word.
So here in the U.S., they wanted to be called suffragists.
IST, yes.
IST, Interesting. Well, Mary, I think a lot of women, especially the millennial women, don't know how few rights women had before. I mean, even like the right to vote came when my mother was born, so I always thought of it as being like way past so before me that it didn't matter. But when I started to understand, it really was a big deal, because the drumbeat for women's rights, when you think that was 1920, but the drumbeat for women's rights started even before Alice Paul was born. So will you take us back to the time, of before Alice Paul was born, to explain, and her, when she was growing up, where were women's rights? Where were women in terms of rights at that point?
Well, it's usually said to date to 1848, when a group of women, actually men and women, gathered at Seneca Falls, which is now a National Historic Park for this reason. And there they passed a document called it was Equal Rights for Women, basically. It was modeled after the Declaration of Independence here. Declaration of Sentiments is what it was called. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who would become well known with Susan B. Anthony,
right,
as this dynamic duo who led the fight for women's rights all through the 19th century, banded together, and one of their demands was the right to vote. But there was so much that women didn't have through all those years that they had other things to work on. Married women were discriminated against. A widow or a single woman could own property. A married woman could not. A married woman had no rights to her paycheck. If she dared divorce, and divorce was certainly frowned upon, the husband automatically got the children. And while much of that those restrictions had eased, especially in the North, not so much in the South, by the time Alice Paul came along, there was still a lot of laws on the books that discriminated against women. And, of course, they didn't have the right to vote.
Right, and I was reading in your book that and I'm quoting your book here. Voting would men didn't want to give women the right to vote because, and this is the quote, voting would distract women from their sacred domestic roles of motherhood and wifely duties. And I'm reading that, Mary, and I'm hysterical laughing because I don't think I've ever thought of my sacred domestic roles. Can you imagine anybody today thinking about that?
It's hard, isn't it?
It is hard. Even my mother didn't think of it that way.
Well, I think back to my mother, not so much as certainly my grandmother was
yes.
all about hearth and home, and and certainly she favored voting. But she didn't think highly of mothers going out to work, and that persisted, as you know, for many years.
Sure. Mm-hmm. Well, you know what, Mary? There's in my first book, Victorious Woman, I interviewed a lot of women, but one of the women included in that book was Jean Ott, and she's probably now in her, I would guess, early 70s. But when she went back, she was married to an alcoholic and had 2 kids, and she was getting ready to leave, so she decided to go back to work. They asked her what kind of birth control she was using. So even just that was probably the 60s or 70s. It's a little shocking that anybody would even ask that question.
Well, I remember being 35 and thinking I had one child and thinking of having another child. And the gynecologist suggested, why don't you have your tubes tied? You're really too old to have more children.
Oh, that's nice. And then, of course, now today, women are having babies into their 40s, so... I know. In fact, one of my magazine stories, when I was a reporter back then, was titled, Why Women Hate Their Gynecologists. And I got more mail on that than almost any other story I've ever written. People telling me their stories, you know. Well, but you know what, Mary? I don't think we were schooled to be advocates for our own health at that point. Do you know what I mean? I think now we tend to speak up a little bit more and a little faster.
Yeah. It's about time, isn't it?
Yeah. So, and the other thing about women getting the right to vote is that men were worried that women were too emotional to make considered judgments.
Yes.
So I'm not sure how considered judgments didn't come into running a household or raising children.
Yes.
You know, it seems almost counterintuitive, doesn't it?
Yes, but it was okay to make judgments in the household. But what they were talking about was judgments in politics. Politics was this messy business. It was smoke-filled rooms, and it really wasn't a place for women.
Now, for Alice Paul, it was a little bit different because I didn't know this till I read your book, that she was part of a well-to-do Quaker family. And part of the thing was the well-to-do part, and the other part was the Quaker part, because Quakers gave women more rights. Am I saying it right?
Yes, you're absolutely right.
And so she grew up a little bit differently than some of the women of her day might have grown up.
Yes, but that's part of what motivated her. The fact that, Quakers believe in total equality. Quakers believe that every human being is linked to God, linked to the deity by an invisible light. And if you have this direct link to God, then everybody is equal, right? So Alice grows up thinking and being taught that everyone is equal. And she and her mother, Casey Paul, went to voting rights meetings, suffrage meetings in New Jersey at that time. So she was raised in a fairly prosperous family. Her father was a banker. But also she was raised to believe in equality. So that was very much a factor in her struggle for the vote.
Mary, we need to take a break. And when we come back, I want to start talking about that relationship a little bit between Alice and her mother and her education and all of that, which really fascinated me as I was reading your book. So let's take a break, and everybody stay with us. You're listening to the Friday Happy Hour. Hi, this is Annmarie Kelly, author, victory strategist, and the radio show host of the Friday Happy Hour. I trust you're enjoying my conversation with this fabulous, victorious woman. If you're getting inspired with ideas and feeling empowered, this is just the tip of the iceberg. There's more for you. Tips, downloads, resources at the Victorious Woman Project. Go to victoriouswoman.com and look around and get on my mailing list so you can be the first to know about the newest good things I have for you. That's www.victoriouswoman.com. Welcome back to the Friday Happy Hour. I'm Annmarie Kelly, and we're here with Mary Walton. We're talking about Alice Paul, the suffragist. Alice Paul. So, did I pick this up correctly, Mary, that Alice, you were just saying before we went to break that Alice and her mother went to meetings about equal rights, about the right to vote. But it seemed to me, especially when she was in Europe, that she had kind of a contentious relationship with her mother. Did I read it right?
I wouldn't say that. I think it was typically a sort of young, rebellious woman chafing at her mother's desire that she be more proper.
Right.
And her mother wanted her to come home, and she never came out and said this,
Thanks for listening to this Friday Happy Hour. Make sure you subscribe, rate and review today's show. And join us again next week for the Friday Happy Hour with Annmarie Kelly.
Come home, get married, have children. But she didn't want Alice to give up this suffrage business and give up her studies and come back to the United States.
Well, and Alice Paul was able to get a college degree at Swarthmore College, and I didn't know that it was Alice Paul's grandfather who was the co-founder of Swarthmore College.
Well, he certainly contributed raising money. It was a large committee that wanted a Quaker school. Mm-hmm. That location. Actually, there's a dorm at Swarthmore named for Alice Paul. But her mother, the thing was that Swarthmore was co-ed. And the other big college on the outskirts of Philadelphia, you might have heard of it, Haverford, was male only. So Alice, of course, had an edge getting into Swarthmore.
Right.
But she graduated as valedictorian of her high school class at age 16, so she was plenty smart. Mm-hmm. And it represented freedom to her because her Quaker background was quite strict. For example, there was no music in the home. And Alice said, I never heard so much as a hymn until I went to college.
Oh, that's interesting. So I didn't realize that was how that was back when she was growing up.
Well, it was her particular branch of the Society of Friends. They thought that music was dangerous, and if not dangerous, certainly a distraction. And they were the plain people. They wore very plain clothing, so they were very conservative in that way. And then from there, she did a brief turn at social work.
Up in New York.
Yep. I'm sorry, what?
Up in New York. She was in the tenements in New York, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And there she really saw what it was like for poor women and powerless women because they lived in these terrible conditions, tenements and large families, and they struggled for food and health care, and they had no political power. They couldn't agitate for reform because they didn't have the vote. So that was very instructive to her.
Yeah, and she wasn't real happy with the social work part of it. But here's the thing, Mary, I was shocked at how little I knew, and then I really didn't, it's almost embarrassing to tell you since you've written the whole book about it, that I really didn't know that the suffrage movement started in Britain, and that's where Alice Paul went.
Well, the hardcore suffragists were, and the ones who were called suffragettes, were in Britain, and she was attracted to that cause. The suffrage movement existed in the United States, but this was a different kind of suffrage movement. These women demonstrated, and they, as they moved on, their movement actually took a violent turn, but by then Alice had left. But she learned militant tactics. She learned the value of demonstrations, of street corners. She spoke on street corners. She went to political meetings where women weren't allowed to speak, and so they would try to speak and they would be arrested. And it was in England that she went to jail for the first time, and the women went on hunger strikes as a form of protest, and they were force-fed tubes down their throat.
Oh, when I was reading that, I couldn't believe it. I was shocked.
Yeah, it was horrible. The funnel at the top, and they poured in raw eggs and milk, and the women would gag, and it was painful. The tube went in through their nostrils. So you can just imagine that tube trying to get purchase going through the nostrils. Alice said, I never went through it without tears streaming down my face. So
she never quite got over that.
This news drifted back to the United States, and it was another reason her mother, understandably, just wanted her to come home.
Right. So, and she never quite she developed intestinal problems as a result of that, right?
She did.
That she never quite got over.
Well, she did live to be 92, so...
Right. So, Mary, when she came back to the United States, she left Britain, she had all that experience, and she got schooled by the British women. When she got back to the United States, what happened?
Well, when she got back to the United States, women could vote in four states. A state had the power to give women the vote within its borders, and they were all out west. It was Wyoming, Idaho, Utah, and Colorado. And Alice just thought it would be much faster and more efficient to have a federal amendment to the Constitution that would give all the women, guarantee all the women in the country the right to vote. So she, this amendment wasn't new. It had actually been around since 1887, and Susan B. Anthony had worked for this amendment. But then Anthony died and Stanton died, and when Alice got back, the women's movement was sort of, moribund. Not a lot was happening. So when she activated this fight for the federal amendment, and it injected new life into the suffrage movement.
She would, but did I read this correctly? At the very first, when she talked about it, she was sort of laughed out of the conference. Well,
she was. I'm not sure I would put it that way. She frightened them. She was. They certainly objected, but they thought she was too radical, too militant. And that it just wasn't talk about conservative women. These are women who favor suffrage, and yet they didn't favor the tactics that Alice Paul advocated and would go on to carry out.
So, in 1920, the women got the right to vote, and so there were 4 states, and then came this amendment. And what happened with that? Like, how did that end up being the amendment that gave us all the right to vote?
Well, preceding the amendment were Alice really launched her struggle in 1913 with a big parade in Washington. So it took until 1919 before the amendment passed both houses of Congress. You needed a 3/4 vote by each house. So then it passed finally in 1919 after women had done all this that I told you about, and the picketing. They were the first people ever to picket the White House. They were targeting Woodrow Wilson, the president at the time, because he didn't support the amendment. He supported the state by state approach. And they finally turned him around. They turned Congress around. It passes, and then they have to have it ratified by 3/4 of the states. So that was another battle, ratification battle. So instead of fighting, one targeted battle in Congress, they've got the legislature of every state, which has to pass it. And those legislatures are male. It was not easy.
Oh,
finally,
sure.
It passes, and the final state to pass was Tennessee. And it came down. Tennessee was actually tied. It passed the Senate, but was tied in the House of Delegates in Tennessee. So, and they knew it was tied because there was a tie vote on a motion to table it, and so they go through a second time, and they don't go down to the roll call. And this is a wonderful little story. They come to this guy named Harry Byrd. Harry is the youngest member of the legislature. I think he's 23, and Harry had voted against the amendment or on that tie vote. This time he raises his hand and he says, "Aye," and the place goes wild, and all the suffragists in the House, it's packed, are just laughing and crying and embracing each other because they know they've won. And Harry is asked, "Well, Harry, why did you change your vote?" And he said, "Well, I had a note from my mother This is a true story. And his mother said, she basically said, do the right thing, vote for suffrage, and don't keep them waiting. And he says, a boy should always listen to what his mother says.
Oh, isn't that funny? So he's that's sort of like that mother was sort of the pivot on which the whole thing changed, huh?
Yes, I mean it could easily have lost, and that was the 35th state. And the thing was that the 1920 election was coming up, and Alice thought, if we don't have the vote in time for this 1920 election, I'm going to have to wait 4 years. I'm going to lose all my supporters, all my volunteers. So there was a note of desperation in this final chapter.
Well, Mary, Alice Paul didn't stop after that. We need to take a break, but when we come back, I know she didn't stop after that happened, and she was really active for years and years after that. She died in 1977, and she was 92 then, but she was still active, well into the 60s. Let's talk about that when we come back. So everybody stay close. You're listening to the Friday Happy Hour. Are you one of those women who lived the first part of your life as a really good girl? That is, you did all the right things and followed all the so-called rules for women? I was like that too. But have you noticed that once you passed 40, you have less patience for those rules? Maybe you even think that the rules really don't make sense for you anymore. Maybe they never did and you just didn't realize it. Do you want to go where other recovering good girls meet to inspire each other and support their new empowered selves? Then join me, Annmarie Kelly, and some very fabulous victorious women. We're on Facebook at the Victorious Woman Project. So go to facebook.com/Victorious Woman Project. I'll talk to you there. Welcome back to the Friday Happy Hour. I'm Annmarie Kelly. I'm here with Mary Walton. We're talking about the women suffragists and Alice Paul, who was a mover and shaker. And you know what? There was a part of your book, Mary, that I was reading where Alice Paul was really active, and can you tell the story that there was about she was living in a house with some other women, and a neighbor came in to clean, and she turned her into a suffragist. I don't know if it was at that point a suffragist, but she turned her into a politically active woman.
Yes, she. Alice had organized the National Women's Party, and their last headquarters was a house in Washington on Capitol Hill. And she lived there with this dwindling number of women. And, by the way, that's now a national monument. Obama signed it into law. It's called the Belmont School. The Paul Belmont House. Sorry. At any rate, Alice needed help. She didn't have volunteers, and so she hired this woman who was ostensibly going to be her maid, and she was a black woman and was just happy to have this job as a maid. But Alice needed help, and the reason she needed help was that she was lobbying hard for the ERA. After the 19th Amendment passed, giving women the vote, Alice turned around, went to law school, and wrote the Equal Rights Amendment. And she worked for it all the rest of her, as you noted, very long life. So she pressed this maid into service to lobby for the ERA across the street at the Capitol. And the pair formed very tight bonds. It was kind of a wonderful story for as long as Alice lived in that house.
Mm-hmm. And the woman was like, she was a black woman, and she didn't have a lot of that kind of experience. She's like, no, I can't do that. And am I remembering this correctly? Alice Paul said, yes, you can. Yes, you can. Like, really pushed her to step out of her comfort zone.
Right. Just take these papers over to the Hill and deliver them to, Congressman X. And soon she knew all about the ERA and was a big advocate. And I was lucky enough, she had passed, but I was lucky enough to talk to her daughter and learn some of this history.
Oh, that's pretty neat. The sad thing, though, is that Alice ended up being almost destitute. She moved from Washington to Connecticut, and she was almost destitute, and then she was saved by the Quakers. Could you tell my listeners a little bit about that?
Well, yeah, she became too old actually to continue to live independently in this house, and so she went to a kind of assistant living nursing home and moved up in Connecticut, and then she suffered a stroke, and she was really severely debilitated by the stroke, and a guardian was appointed for her, who was her last living relative. Her two brothers and a sister were all gone. This was a nephew. He was appointed her guardian, and she had a few $100,000. She was not poor by any means, and he plundered her estate before it was discovered. And so she ended up with no money, and she was forgotten. The ERA passed Congress, but then it didn't. It failed ratification, and nobody remembered Alice Paul. And a newspaper reporter discovered her and wrote a story and captured the history, recovered the history, and word got back to the Quakers in New Jersey. And so they came forward, and they came up with some money. I think some of them were her relatives, distant relatives, and moved her back to Mount Laurel into a nursing home that was actually on land that her family had once owned. So sort of her life came full circle.
Full circle, yeah.
Right? Back to the Quakers and back to New Jersey. Yeah. But she still worked for the ERA, and there were activists who would come to sort of kneel at the feet of this wonderful feminist icon, and she would say, "Well, what have you?" They would mention the ERA, and her eyes would open wide, and she'd say, "What have you done for the ERA? Call your congressman." And she'd point to the phone, and so even at the end, she was still working for the ERA as long as it was still had a chance.
It was her lifelong passion.
It was? I'm sorry.
I said it was her lifelong passion.
Well, equal rights, yes.
Yep.
Not just that amendment, but equal rights in every way. You're quite right.
You know, Mary, what do you think Alice Paul would think about feminism today, and feminism today, and the growing number of women in Congress, in both who serve in D.C. and who serve locally?
Annmarie, I think she would be delighted, and I think she would say we need more. There aren't
I think
enough.
So. I believe that. And what about the Me Too movement? What do you think she would think about that?
It's hard to go there. You know, it's so much a contemporary movement. She might be kind of stunned. I don't think she would oppose it in any way, because it is women speaking out for their rights, their right to be to be treated with respect, to be taken seriously, and to be able to fight back when that doesn't happen.
Well, you know, Mary, it was my cousin Richard who told me about you and your book, and I'm so glad he did, because I thought it was fascinating, and it's available on Amazon and at our local library. And you're not done with it, because you have a new project coming up. Tell us about that.
Oh, by the way, Annmarie, you've done a wonderful. I've done many radio interviews, and you have researched this subject more thoroughly than almost any. So I thank you for that.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
It's true. My new project is I went back in history to learn more about those early suffragists, and that I focused almost immediately on Susan B. Anthony, because she had another story, and I've written a play about it. It's called The Trial of Susan B. Anthony, because Anthony who lived in New York State, where it was against the law for women to vote, dared to vote in 1872. She went to the polls. She bullied the registers into letting her register. And once registered, they allowed her to vote. She thought none of that would happen, that she would be turned down, and she could take this fight to the Supreme Court. But instead, they let her vote, and so what she envisioned to be this great battle that would result in a Supreme Court judgment giving all women the vote never came to fruition. But it's a wonderful story, and the story of the trial is online, and so I found sort of a new heroine, although there were many, but one that interested me in the fight for women's rights.
And where will you be taking this play? Oh, tell me why it matters that it's coming up. It's going to be getting ready for 2020. Tell me why that matters. 2020
is the 100th anniversary, the centennial of the 19th Amendment, and you and your listeners are going to hear a lot about this starting in a year, because women's organizations, historical organizations are gearing up to celebrate and acknowledge and kind of trumpet the battle that led to the 19th Amendment. So everybody's getting ready, and I hope that my play about Susan B. Anthony, and also my book, of course, but I hope that will be a part of what goes on.
Well, you know what, Mary, when as you move closer to that and the play gets finished and it's, someplace probably local, I'm thinking that it'll be local, touch base with me, because I'll be interested, and I want to pass it along to my listeners and to my Victorious Woman email list, because I think, it's about women's empowerment, and it's about honoring what came before us that gave us the right to be where we are today.
Oh, that's so nice of you. You don't have to ask twice.
I'm glad.
I will be in touch in 2020.
That'll be great. Mary, I'll look forward to talking with you again. Thanks for joining me today.
Thank you, Annmarie. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. And if you want information about Mary Walton, you can see it on today's radio wrap-up at victoriouswoman.com. And thanks. I'm glad that she came to our show. Wasn't that kind of fascinating? There was so much I didn't know. So I have a quote today as we close out our show from, who else? Alice Paul, who said something about the you can tell it's Friday afternoon, about the women's rights movement that I think is as true today as it was then. And Alice Paul said, quote, "I always feel the movement is a sort of mosaic. Each of us puts in one little stone, and then you get a great mosaic at the end." Victory Chicks, and even you guys, we're all doing one little stone, and it's making an incredible mosaic. So have a fun weekend, and by tomorrow we should have spring, so enjoy it. And thanks for coming to Happy Hour today. I'll talk with you next Friday at the Friday Happy Hour. Jen's on.
Thanks for listening to this Friday Happy Hour. Make sure you subscribe, rate and review today's show. And join us again next week for the Friday Happy Hour with Annmarie Kelly. 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 For the Friday Happy Hour with Annmarie Kelly.